Good afternoon. For the post-landing press conference for shuttle mission STS-67 this afternoon, we have with us Brewster Shaw, Director of the Space Shuttle Program, and Rich Jackson, Entry Flight Director for STS-67. And we'll start off with you, Brewster.
Well, good afternoon, Mark, and welcome. We're delighted with the conclusion of STS-67 today. Safe landing for the orbiter and its crew at Edwards Air Force Base in California, culminating 17 days in orbit for the vehicle. And we are delighted that we were able to serve our science customers as well as we were, and that they were able to gather the myriad of data that they did during this mission. I believe everything worked extremely well, and I think everybody's very happy with the outcome, and we're glad to have the vehicle on the ground. And now we look forward to working towards our next scheduled flight, which is the first flight of a shuttle to dock with the Mir space station.
Okay, Rich.
Okay. Good afternoon. Glad to be here with you guys. The situation we had today, of course, was another tough weather call similar to our launch. Our SMG folks, Tim and Carl in specific, did an excellent job in helping us get off the pad on time on the initial day, and also they had a tough case dealing with the weather wave off yesterday, and again dealing with the weather today. As weather is, you're only dealt what you have to work with that day, and weather did not present us an opportunity to get into the Kennedy Space Center today. All three opportunities to the Kennedy Space Center were no-go. That did put us off into the Edwards opportunity, and we performed a successful landing at an MET of 16 days, 15 hours, 8 minutes, and 47 seconds at Edwards complex. That was a new STS space shuttle endurance record, and everything went real well through the timeline. We did accomplish the DTOs that we had planned for the entry profile. Our aerodynamic and subsonic maneuver DTOs were all accomplished, and that does conclude those test programs. The official OBS, just anticipating this question, in terms of the crosswind, we did have a 5 peak 8 knot crosswind at landing time, and that was the official OBS. The wind was basically 245, 15 peak 22 knots. And again, that's all I have for right now, so we'll entertain questions.
Okay, Mark Carreau, Houston Chronicle.
Thank you. I have one question for Rich Jackson, and that was the call to go ahead with the reentry burn was about 4 or 5 minutes ahead of the actual burn for the Edwards landing. I just wondered, was it just the winds you were talking about? Was there anything else that was an issue, or did it just look a little closer than it actually was?
It was predominantly the winds. We were monitoring the winds at Edwards. They had peaked up and were gusting a little bit. We had a long conversation on the flight loop with our SMG folks in terms of what the worst case direction and magnitude for those winds would be. We were, of course, on this mission operating under more restrictive placards than normal shuttle landings. We had a 12 knot peak crosswind limit, and we wanted to ensure that before we committed to the burn that we had bracketed what we thought worst case would be. And our SMG folks were pretty firm in their position in terms of what they expected that worst case to be, and that allowed us to converge and give a final go for the burn at about the 5 minute before the TIG time period.
All right, we'll switch now to the Kennedy Space Center for questions there.
Yeah, Bill Harwood, CBS for Brewster Shaw. Brewster, looking ahead to STS-71, there was a lot of talk last week that the Spectre module is facing a potentially significant launch delay by the Russians, and my question is twofold. A, what have you all heard in Houston about Spectre's launch and any possible slip? And B, what is your strategy with regard to Spectre? Does it have to be there before you will launch 71? If there's a slip to Spectre, does 71 necessarily have to slip? Could you flip-flop 71 and 70 in that regard? What sort of options are you guys looking at down the road?
Well, first of all, I don't know exactly what the Russian schedule looks like right now. Tommy Holloway was over in Russia this past week and will be back this weekend. He's talked directly with his counterparts there, and we'll have a better indication of how they're doing when he gets back. And based upon the prediction of their schedule, we will refine our plans with respect to a 71 schedule, and then we'll wait and see what really happens. We do have some flexibility. We can fly without the Spectre there, but it's preferable, of course, to go up after the Spectre arrives. And so we'll work with our Russian partners and decide what the best course of action is, depending on how the schedules flow.
And just a quick follow-up, is there any pressure, time-critical kind of stuff to get 71 off in early June? Does it matter? I mean, from a shuttle scheduling standpoint for the downstream flights, if it did in fact slip into July and you ended up launching 71st, is that a big problem for you guys?
Well, I don't think it matters any more than normal with respect to trying to maintain the manifest that we've laid out ahead of us. Of course, every slip tends to ripple down to the right, so we try to minimize those, but we can recover from whatever happens.
This is Todd Halverson of Florida Today for Rich Jackson. I'm wondering if you guys were both observed and forecast go on all weather criteria at the time you gave the go for the deorbit burn.
Yes, sir, absolutely. That's the reason that we had the conversation and carried it as far as we did. The team had basically postured us in a position where we could continue the conversation right down to the last minute, and we took advantage of that to ensure that we had a pretty good understanding of exactly what phenomenon we were flying into.
And one for Brewster. You guys pulled engines on 104 this week in order to swap out 2 of the fuel turbo pumps, and I believe the reason was the same deal you were dealing with prior to Endeavor's flight with the volute liner cracking on the test article out at Stennis. I'm wondering what you saw in the time since Endeavor's launch that convinced you that you needed to go pull those pumps and replace them.
Well, the test unit that you referred to that had developed crack was disassembled and dissected so that we were able to look at the crack specifically and see what kind of failure it was. It turned out to be a high cycle fatigue failure. And the 2 units that were on 104 had more time on them than the unit that was on 105 that we just flew. So we decided that since we had time available to do the work, it was a more conservative approach to pull those off and replace them. And so that's what we did.
This is Seth Borenstein from the Orlando Sentinel. If you can just explain for me quickly why not go one more day to see if the weather improves in Kennedy Space Center?
I can take that one.
Okay.
Okay, basically what we're dealing with is we had a forecast for Edwards that was still go for tomorrow. However, there was a frontal system coming through and Monday was definitely out. So tomorrow for Edwards wasn't as good. The Kennedy Space Center again was showing some improvement. However, this was our first flight at the extended duration orbiter length of mission of 16 days. We have flight rules on the book that allow us to waive off 1 day for weather, but we're concerned and trying to follow a logical progression, if you will, for extending the mission duration. And according to those rules, which are very conservative, but do allow for that conservative buildup, we're only allowed to extend 1 day for weather. And with that in mind, we really wanted to land today, and as long as we had a go obs and forecast site to get into, we were going to go ahead and land.
Okay, and this may sound silly, but what's the discoloration on the payload bay, left side of the payload bay door?
Yeah, I noticed that on the film, but I'm not sure. We'll have to wait and see what the analysis shows.
We'll go now to the Dryden Flight Research Facility for questions from there.
This is Jane Allen from the Associated Press. Getting back to that same question about extending or not extending, I'm wondering how much of a consideration there was about Commander Oswald's ability to negotiate tough winds, and considering that fatigue is probably starting to play a role, how dangerous it might have been or how risky or what concern you would have had about staying up an extra day and putting those astronauts through fairly taxing extra time.
Rich mentioned earlier that we had different crosswind limits for this flight because it was an EDO flight, and we reduced the crosswind limits from our nominal 15 knots to 12 knots, just for the very reason you're speaking of, because there is some concern that with a longer duration flight that crew members may be somewhat affected when they come back and try to land the vehicle. And as we discover more about this, then we'll be able to refine our flight rules. But for right now, since we are in the middle of a build-up program with respect to flight duration on the space shuttle and sit-up reentries, we did change the flight rules to allow only 12 knots for extended duration flights. And we did consider the ability of a commander to land the vehicle in our buildup of flight duration. And so taking that all together, we do talk about the extra duration, and that does come into play in making decisions about how many days you wave off to try to get to any particular landing site. But everything that we did on this particular flight was in concert with the rules we'd set out for ourselves before flight, and I think it was executed properly.
We understand there are additional questions at Kennedy, so we'll return there for the remainder of the Kennedy Space Center questions.
Pete Galtieri with the West Kentucky News. Can you go over the mission elapsed time again, and can you give us the wheel stop time, please?
Yes, sir, sure can. The main gear touchdown at 16 days, 15 hours, 8 minutes, and 47 seconds. And the wheel stop was at 16 days, 15 hours, 9 minutes, and 46 seconds.
And the crosswinds, again, were 5 knots with a 10-knot peak. Is that correct?
No, sir. It was 5 knots peak, 8 knots.
Thank you. There are more questions.
This is Stephen Young with Astronomy Now. A question for Brewster Shaw. I was just wondering if you approved any waivers for any weather rules or anything else associated with the landing.
No.
That's all from Kennedy.
That's the final question from Kennedy Space Center. Thank you, Brewster, and thank you, Rich, and that wraps up the briefing. Thank you.